Hello, and welcome to Personality Theory. In this section of lectures, I'm going to be covering topics that are introduced in chapters 1 and 2 of the Friedman and Shustak textbook that we're using this quarter. I kind of have blended some of the concepts together into one big chapter 1 and 2. What is personality, and how is personality studied and assessed? So I'm going to start right now by apologizing for the sound of the furnace in the background. It is currently winter quarter while I'm recording these lectures so that I can get a little bit ahead. And so the heater mechanism is right outside my window, and I can see from my mic register that it's picking up the noise. I also will apologize in advance in case my dog barks. So this is not, I may be presenting these videos on YouTube, but I am not a YouTuber. I am a professor. So, all right. I always like to start this class by helping people to figure out what their own personal personality theory is. This class will present a series of different theories, and really there's no one that's been proven to be the correct theory. Each one has its own components that are more or less supported by data. So you're just as valid of a personality theorist as anyone else. So let's go ahead and have you take this little 10-item scale. What you want to imagine is that you've got, for question 1, you've got an answer that's going to range somewhere from you think personality is completely hereditary, so you're going to mark something closer to the 1, or you think it's completely environmental, and so you're going to mark something closer to the 7. If you think it's a combination of both equally contributing, then you'd be more like a 4. So you can give yourself a rating for each of these questions. So do you think personality is due to heredity, or do you think it's due to environment? Do you think there is such a thing as a self, or do you think there is no such thing as a self? Do you think personality is unchanging from the moment you're born? You have the personality that you have, and it's the same personality throughout your lifespan? Or do you think that it changes as you age? Do you think that personality is more dependent on your past, or do you think it's more dependent on striving towards the future? Do you think that there are general personality traits that make a lot of us very similar to each other, or do you think that there are a lot of qualities that make each of us unique and different from each other? Do you think people are generally self-centered, or do you think on average they're more altruistic, trying to do things for other people more often than they would do things for themselves? Now remember, you can give a rating anywhere along the spectrum. So you can be in the middle, you can be leaning towards the left-hand descriptor, you can be leaning towards the right-hand descriptor. So, be open to all the different numbers. Do you think we're motivated more by rewards, or do you think we're more motivated by avoiding punishment? Do you think that our personality is more based on our own personal experiences, or that it's more influenced by social factors? Do you think that personality is more constructive, that you build it up, or do you think it's more destructive, that you get rid of things that aren't adaptive? Do you think that there is no purpose to personality, or do you think that there is a purpose to personality? Okay, so you might want to pause me now that I've kind of explained each of these, and go ahead and pick your actual answers, because after that, I'm going to go ahead and reveal what the different theorists that we're going to be meeting during the quarter will say about these things. So you might want to go ahead and pause me. All right, I'm going to assume that you either paused me or aren't playing this game. Either one's fine. I don't know what you're doing. So hopefully you've given answers, because it's more fun if you sort of place yourself and then see who you agree with more or less. And you might be surprised who you agree with. So let's go ahead and reveal who says what. So on the side of heredity, we're going to meet theorists named Hans Eysenck. We're going to meet Cattell, Sheldon, not from Big Bang Theory. This one's his last name. Freud's follower Jung. So these people are all going to have theories that are really heavily based on heredity as an explanation for personality. Over on the other end of the spectrum that really relies on environment as an explanation for personality will be Skinner, Watson. Those are really heavy behaviorists. Rotter, Bandura, those are big social learning theorists. And then Rogers, who's a humanist. So we're going to see all of those people as we go on. If you think that there is a self, you're in agreement with Rogers, Maslow, Erikson, who was actually a follower of Freud's, Horney and Jung, also followers of Freud. If you think there really is no self, or that the self doesn't really help us to explain personality, that's another way to put it, you're going to be in the same category as the behaviorists, Watson and Skinner, and then social learning theorists like Rotter and Mischel. If you think that personality is unchanging, that you are how you are from birth and you just sort of always are like that, you're going to be in agreement with Freud, Eysenck, and Cattell. If you think that you change as you grow and develop and that you internalize things from your experiences to help inform your personality, you're going to be in agreement with Rogers and Mischel. If you think that the past is really super important in developing your personality, then you're going to agree with the Freudians like Freud and Jung, Erich Fromm, who's a humanist, and then Hans Eysenck, who again is a biologically leaning person. You're going to all of them agree that the past is the most important part in forming your personality. Future strivings are emphasized by Adler, and he was a Freudian theorist, and that's one of the things he disagreed with Freud about. Rogers, who's a humanist, and Maslow, who's a humanist, they both argue that our future strivings are the most important factor. And then Bandura, who's a social learning theorist, and he really emphasized the idea that we're all trying to grow and develop. If you think that personality is general, that we all share things that, are in common, then you're going to be in agreement with Watson, Skinner, Eysenck, and Fromm. If you think that we're all unique and we're a compilation of, all these factors that are unique to us, then you're going to be more Adler, Rogers, Bandura, and Rotter. If you think that we are generally more self-centered, you're going to be a Freud or Jung supporter. If you think in general we're more altruistic and that we put others before ourselves, at least sometimes, then you're going to be more in agreement with Adler, Fromm, Maslow, Rogers, and Bandura. Now, I've put them on the polar ends just so I can make little clusters and not confuse people, but honestly, you're going to find that they are not necessarily 1s and 7s either. They're going to be, 1, 2, 3s on the left side, 5, 6, 7s on the right side, but I just put them, on the right so they'd be separate, or on the left so they'd be separate from each other. If you think that we're more motivated by rewards, then you're going to agree with Skinner, Bandura, Freud, and Maslow. If you think that we're more interested in avoiding punishment, that was the perspective of Watson. If you think that personality is a personal thing that we develop, that's unique to us and those kinds of things, you're going to be in agreement with Rogers, Maslow, and Fromm. If you think that the social setting really determines your personality, then you're going to agree with Skinner, Bandura, and Mischel. If you think that it's something that we build up, that it's constructive, that's Adler, Rogers, and Maslow. If you think it's destructive, that you're getting rid of unhelpful or destructive parts of your personality, that would be Freud. If you think that there's no purpose to personality, that it's just something that is and it doesn't really serve a purpose, you're going to agree with Skinner, Watson, Bandura, and Mischel. If you think that there is a purpose to personality, that it does something for us, that it's somehow adaptive or helpful, then you're going to be in agreement with Adler, Fromm, Horney, Rogers, Maslow, and Jung. All right. So I know you've never heard of most of these people. I'll bet you've heard of Freud. If you've had introductory psychology, which I think you probably have, you've heard of Skinner probably. He was the one who did, the operant conditioning where you reward the desired behaviors. He's the one who came up with the terms positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement, and then positive punishment and negative punishment. So you've probably heard about them. You've probably heard of Bandura. He's the one who had the experiment where the kids were playing with a Bobo doll, the inflatable doll that looks like a clown. And he was looking to see whether they would behave more aggressively towards that doll if they saw an adult, role model being really aggressive with it. So you might remember Bandura. You may not remember their names, but you probably at least have heard of them. You might remember Watson. He's the one who did the research on little Albert to try and to develop a phobia in him of white rats. You might remember that story. Let's see, who else have you heard of? Rogers. You might have, your introductory psychology class might have covered Rogers and his humanistic approach to not only personality, but also therapy for psychological disorders. Very much of a humanist and assumed the best of people. So some of these people might be somewhat familiar to you. And then you might have learned about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where self-actualization was at the top. That might sound familiar. So you may have heard of some of these people, but probably a lot of them you haven't heard of, and you're really going to learn about them in this class. So hopefully you agree with a variety of people probably. right? There's probably, in some ways you might agree with Freud, and in other ways you agree with Rogers, and you probably don't agree down the line with a single theorist. And so I always find that kind of encouraging, because that means there will probably be something in every theory that we're going to cover in class that you're going to be like, yeah, I kind of agree with that part of it. I may not agree with the whole theory, but I agree with at least certain components of each theory as an explanation for personality. So how do we evaluate personality theory? Since you're going to meet so many different theorists, what are you supposed to do with this information? Well, I will give you some things that you can be filtering these theories through that might help you to decide which theory you are leaning more towards or that you think is more credible. So first off is how comprehensive the theory is. How many different aspects of personality are included? You're going to find that certain theorists attempt to explain all aspects of personality. Like Freud, one of the things that we have to give the man credit for is that he attempted to explain everything you can think of that has to do with personality, and probably even a little bit more than you would have thought of. Like he talked about, where does it come from? What role do our parents play in us developing our personality? What are the healthy ways that a personality can appear, and what are the unhealthy ways that it can appear? What are the conscious parts of it? What are the unconscious parts? I mean, he covered things that you probably wouldn't have even thought of if he hadn't introduced it. And then other theories are not very comprehensive. Like Skinner's theory really focuses exclusively on, the observable behaviors that make up, what we would count as your personality. And then how we can maybe shape those behaviors and as a result make it seem like a person has a different personality, at least for the moment, right? Like he was very specific. It was just about behavior. He did try to explain that, your personality today is a reflection of all the, punishments and reinforcements you've experienced in the past. He did explain, the role of the past. He did explain the role of the, environmental situation, but I mean, he was very limited. He wasn't as comprehensive in his theory. So comprehensiveness might be something that you think is important. Like if you want all these aspects of personality explained by one single theory, you might lean towards certain theories. If on the other hand, you just want certain aspects to be explained as well as they can be, and maybe it doesn't explain everything, you might be satisfied with other theories. Precision. How clearly the concepts of the theory are defined. So did the theorist, make a really clear explanation of these different aspects that they are invoking in their effort to explain personality? Some theorists are really, really specific, and, for example, the behaviorists are going to have not only really specific descriptions, but really just specific ways of measuring, the different aspects of personality, like very clear and observable. Other theorists are going to be very much more ambiguous, and they will talk about things that can never be directly observed. And so precision is a really important part of a personality theory. Like, are we all talking about the same thing when we use that word? That kind of thing. Testability, I kind of started leaning into that when I was describing precision, right? How conducive the concepts are to empirical research. Some theories certain aspects of them can never be tested. Like there's no way to know, for example, if you even have an unconscious, let alone whether it contains the parts of the personality that Freud says it does, let alone whether they have the impact or the effect that Freud says that they do. So it's all very untestable. And so that makes the theory potentially for some readers less meaningful than if it were something that we could directly test and see whether his predictions are supported or refuted by the data. So some theories are going to be much more testable, others are going to be less testable. Parsimony. This is a term that refers to the concept that the simplest explanation should be assumed to be true. So if you're concerned about parsimony as a person who's trying to decide which theory you really like, you want to make sure that you are looking at the theory for, the clarity of its explanation, right? So the precision, its testability, right? And then also how many different mechanisms does the theory have to invoke in order to make the theory make sense? Do you have to have a whole bunch of, is it a Rube Goldberg kind of setup where you have all these different moving parts that must line up in order to produce a particular personality? Or is it simpler where you have a direct line where the ball just rolls down one chute and causes the personality to emerge? So parsimony is this concept of, the simplest explanation should be assumed to be true. So as a consumer, hopefully you'll lean that way because that's kind of an overarching concept in science in general, is that you should always assume the simplest explanation makes more sense. And also in the scientific side, we want to have testable concepts. So we want to have precise definitions. The comprehensiveness is where that's not really something about science necessarily. Having a less comprehensive but very precise, testable, and parsimonious theory is important in science. So if you want to think scientifically, you want a precise, testable, and parsimonious explanation. We also would like to see some empirical validity, right, where we have objective data to support the theory. So not only is it testable, but maybe it has been tested, right? And we have evidence to point to that says that this theory is explaining something out in the real world, people's personalities out in the real world. The heuristic value is related to that. The theory makes sense in the real world. Some of our theories have been established just as sort of more philosophical, where it's a person sort of trying to explain what other people have found, and the theory isn't necessarily directly tied to the data collection. And so is that heuristically valid? Is that something that a person, that what this explanation this person has offered really explains how an actual person out in the real world, how their personality manifests itself? So, is it helpful? I think an ancillary to the heuristic value is not only is it helpful, but is it meaningful? Does it matter that I know this about myself? Does it matter that I know this about other people? Will this help me to understand other people? And that's what we call the applied value. So does it make sense in reality? Does it actually play out in reality? And then does it matter? Does it matter if you know that people's personalities are affected by the series of reinforcements and punishments they've had in the past or not? Does it matter that you believe that there's an unconscious that motivates behavior? Does that matter? Does that actually help us to understand other people or make good hiring decisions or things like that? So these are the 7 things that I would argue you want to look at when you're being introduced to a new theory. Whatever you think is more important is what you want to emphasize, right? Now, for us in psychology, we tend to emphasize the scientific components. So, is it precise, testable? Is it parsimonious? We don't necessarily worry about the heuristic and applied value as much per se as we do the scientific side. Is there empirical validity? Has the data that's been collected actually support what this theory predicts? So we look at those 4 scientific components. Comprehensiveness, some people think that's important, other people think it's less important. And then the heuristic and applied value, some people think is important, some people don't within the field of psychology. But for sure, those 4 middle ones seem to be the thing that in, sort of scientific value. All right. This is a good time to stop. In the next segment, we'll talk about different ways to know things. All right. See you then.